Welcome aboard Bedtime Express, where we journey together through history's most captivating tales designed to carry you gently into peaceful sleep. Tonight, we're setting sail with the brave Norse explorers who discovered North America 5 centuries before Columbus ever dreamed of the New World. You'll travel alongside Leif Erikson and his fellow Vikings as they cross the whale road to Vinland, encountering lands of incredible abundance and wonder. If you enjoy these historical bedtime adventures, please like this video, write in comments from which part of the world you are joining us, and subscribe to Bedtime Express for more tranquil tales from across time and around the world. Now, find your most comfortable position, let your breathing slow and deepen, and prepare to embark on a peaceful voyage through the mists of time to an age of courage, discovery, and ancient dreams. Close your eyes and let the gentle rhythm of our story carry you like waves against a distant shore. Viking expeditions to North America. In the year 985 of the Common Era, when the world seemed smaller and the oceans larger than we can imagine today, when maps ended in dragons and warnings about sailing off the edge of creation, there lived a man named Erik the Red in the harsh beauty of Iceland. His hair was indeed as fiery as his name suggested, flowing like autumn leaves caught in the crisp Nordic wind that swept down from glaciers older than human memory. But Erik was not merely a man of temper, he was a dreamer, a seeker of new lands beyond the misty horizons that called to him each dawn like a siren's song of possibility. Iceland in those days was a place of dramatic contrasts that could take your breath away with both beauty and terror. Volcanic peaks pierced the sky like ancient spears thrown by forgotten gods, while glacial fields stretched endlessly under the pale sun that never quite decided whether it was rising or setting during the brief summer months. Geysers erupted from the earth with clockwork regularity, shooting columns of boiling water high into the air, as if the planet itself were breathing through stone lungs. The aurora borealis danced across winter skies in curtains of green and purple light that seemed to whisper secrets in languages older than human speech. The settlers who had come to this volcanic island were hardy folk indeed, descendants of Norwegian chieftains and Celtic slaves, Saxon thralls and Danish adventurers, all seeking freedom from the crowded fjords and political turmoil of their various homelands. They had learned to read the language of wind and wave, of aurora and star, of volcanic tremor and glacier crack, for their very survival depended upon understanding nature's subtle messages and responding with the wisdom born of necessity. These were people who could predict storms by the way seabirds flew, who knew which mushrooms would sustain life and which would bring death, who could navigate by stars invisible to untrained eyes. Erik the Red had been exiled from Iceland for 3 years due to a blood feud. a common occurrence in those days when honor was measured by the sword and disputes settled through violence that echoed through generations. The particular quarrel that led to his banishment had begun over grazing rights and escalated through a series of killings and counter-killings until the local thing or assembly decreed that Erik must leave Iceland's shores for the span of 3 winters. Rather than despair at his banishment, Erik saw opportunity stretching before him like an uncharted sea, vast and full of promise for those bold enough to explore its depths. He had heard whispers from other sailors about a vast landmass to the west, glimpsed through fog and storm, green and promising despite its northern latitude. Some called it Gunnbjorn's land, after the first Norse sailor reported to have seen it through the mists during a voyage that had been blown off course by unexpected storms. Others spoke of it in more mystical terms, as if it were a land that appeared only to those pure enough of heart or desperate enough of circumstance to deserve such a revelation. The stories varied with each telling, but they all agreed on one essential point. There was land to the west, and it was bigger than Iceland, and it was waiting for someone brave enough to claim it. With his family and a small band of loyal followers, Erik loaded their possessions into sturdy longships. These vessels were marvels of Norse engineering, shallow-drafted boats that could navigate both open ocean and shallow coastal waters with equal grace. Their dragon-headed prows cut through waves while their square sails caught every favorable wind. The ships were not large by our standards, perhaps 60 to 70 feet long, but they were perfectly designed for exploration and survival in the harsh northern seas. As Erik's small fleet sailed westward from Iceland, the familiar landmarks gradually disappeared behind them. The last glimpse of Mount Hekla's snow-capped peak faded into memory as they entered the vast expanse of the Denmark Strait. Here, where the Greenland Sea meets the North Atlantic, icebergs drifted like floating castles, some as large as islands, others delicate as crystal sculptures carved by wind and wave. The voyage was not without peril. Sudden storms could arise from nowhere, transforming calm seas into towering walls of grey water that threatened to swallow their small vessels. The men took turns at the oars when the wind failed them, their backs straining against the endless expanse of ocean. At night, they navigated by the stars, using the same constellations that had guided their ancestors across the Baltic Sea and down the rivers of Russia. Days merged into one another as they sailed through the pristine wilderness of the North Atlantic. They encountered whales, massive creatures that surfaced near their boats with curiosity rather than fear, their ancient eyes reflecting a wisdom older than human memory. Seabirds followed in their wake, crying out in languages that seemed to speak of distant shores and hidden harbors. Sometimes, when the sun hung low on the horizon, casting golden paths across the water, it seemed as though they were sailing not just through space, but through time itself. Finally, after many days of sailing through increasingly ice-filled waters that sparkled like scattered diamonds under the northern sun, a new coastline appeared on the western horizon like a dream made manifest. At first, it was nothing more than a thin line between sea and sky, so faint that the crew wondered if they were seeing clouds or mirages born of salt spray and wishful thinking. But as they sailed closer, the land resolved into something magnificent and terrible. Massive fjords carved deep into coastal mountains by glaciers that had worked their slow magic over millions of years. Ice rivers that carved icebergs directly into the sea, with sounds like thunder echoing across the water, and yet, in the protected valleys visible between the peaks, patches of surprisingly green vegetation that hinted at the land's hidden potential for sustaining human life. The coastline they encountered was unlike anything they had seen in their northern homelands, more dramatic even than the famous fjords of Norway that their grandfathers still spoke of with reverence and longing. Here were mountains that dwarfed anything in Iceland, their peaks lost in clouds that seemed to touch the very roof of the world. Glaciers descended from these heights like frozen rivers of blue-white ice, some so vast that they created their own weather systems, generating winds and fogs that could envelop a ship in minutes and transform a clear day into a whiteout where navigation became a matter of prayer and instinct. Erik named this new land Greenland, not because it was particularly green compared to more temperate regions, but as a clever bit of Viking marketing that demonstrated his understanding of human psychology. He knew that if he were to attract settlers to join him in this harsh but promising land, he needed to give it an appealing name that would capture imaginations and inspire courage in those who heard it. Men will be more eager to go there if the country has a good name, he reportedly said, showing that even Viking explorers understood the power of positive branding and the importance of hope in motivating human endeavor. The name was not entirely dishonest. In the sheltered valleys of southern Greenland, there were indeed meadows green enough to remind homesick Norse settlers of the farmlands they had left behind. The first winters in Greenland tested every survival skill the Norse possessed, and then demanded that they develop new ones suited to this environment that was harsher than anything their ancestors had faced. They built their homes partially underground, using stone and turf construction techniques perfected in Iceland and Norway, but adapted to the unique challenges of the Arctic climate. These houses were designed to conserve every bit of heat during the long polar nights, with narrow windows that minimized heat loss and thick walls that could withstand howling Arctic winds capable of driving grown men to their knees. Inside, families gathered around central hearths that burned driftwood, whale oil, and anything else that could provide warmth and light, sharing stories and maintaining the oral traditions that connected them to their ancestral homelands across the sea. But survival was only the beginning. Erik and his fellow settlers began to explore their new territory, discovering that Greenland was far larger than Iceland, stretching north and south far beyond what any single expedition could map. They found excellent hunting grounds where seals, walruses, and polar bears provided meat, oil, and materials for tools and clothing. They also discovered that certain fjords were ice-free year-round, creating perfect harbors for their longships. Most importantly, they found that despite its harsh climate, Greenland could support a pastoral lifestyle similar to what they had known in Iceland. In the sheltered valleys of the south, they could raise sheep, goats, and cattle. They could grow barley and other hardy grains during the brief but intense summer months when the sun barely set below the horizon. It was a hard life, but it was sustainable, and it offered something precious to the Norse spirit: independence and room to grow. Over the following years, more settlers arrived from Iceland and Norway, drawn by reports of Erik's successful colony. Two major settlements developed: the eastern settlement near the southern tip of Greenland, and the western settlement further north along the coast. These communities would endure for nearly 5 centuries, creating a Norse presence in North America that predated Columbus by half a millennium. Among those who came to Greenland was Erik's son Leif. Born around 970 CE, Leif Erikson grew up listening to his father's tales of exploration and adventure. But while Erik had found his destiny in the green valleys of Greenland, Leif's eyes were drawn ever westward to the mysterious lands that lay beyond even this new frontier. As a young man, Leif was tall and strong, with the keen intelligence that marked the best of Norse navigators. He learned to read the subtle signs that revealed the ocean's moods, the color of the water that indicated depth, the formation of clouds that suggested land beyond the horizon, the flight patterns of seabirds that revealed the direction of the nearest coast. These skills would serve him well in the great adventure that awaited him. In the year 999, Leif Erikson sailed from Greenland to Norway, where he spent the winter at the court of King Olaf Tryggvason. This was a time when Christianity was spreading throughout the Norse world, and King Olaf was a zealous convert who made it his mission to bring the new faith to all Viking territories. Leif embraced Christianity during his stay in Norway, and when he returned to Greenland the following year, he brought with him not only the new faith, but also tales of lands even further west than Greenland. The stories that captured Leif's imagination came from a trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had been blown off course while sailing from Iceland to Greenland around 985 CE. Bjarni reported sighting land to the west of Greenland, land that was forested and hilly, unlike the rocky, ice-bound coast of Greenland itself. Being a cautious merchant rather than an explorer, Bjarni had not landed to investigate these mysterious shores, but had instead corrected his course and continued on to Greenland. However, his account of well-forested land sparked intense curiosity among the more adventurous spirits in the Greenland colonies. Leif purchased Bjarni's ship and began planning an expedition that would investigate these western lands properly. Unlike his father's colonization of Greenland, this would be purely a voyage of exploration, an attempt to map the coastline and assess the potential of these mysterious territories. He gathered a crew of 35 men, all experienced sailors and skilled in the arts of survival in unknown territories. As summer approached in the year 1001 CE, preparations for the voyage intensified. The ship was loaded with provisions for several months at sea: dried fish and meat, hardtack bread, barrels of fresh water, and ale for special occasions. They brought tools for repairs and construction, weapons for hunting and protection, and trade goods in case they encountered other peoples. Most importantly, they brought the accumulated wisdom of generations of Norse seafarers, knowledge of stars and currents, weather patterns, and navigation techniques that would guide them safely across unknown waters. On the eve of their departure, as the midnight sun cast long shadows across the Greenland settlement, Leif stood at the harbor looking westward. Beyond the familiar fjords lay an ocean that stretched to the very edge of the known world. Somewhere out there, beyond the curve of the earth, lay lands that no European had ever explored. The western winds seemed to call to him, carrying scents and promises of adventure that stirred his Viking soul. Tomorrow they would sail into legend. The dawn of Leif Erikson's departure brought with it a gentle mist that clung to the surface of the Greenland fjord, like the breath of sleeping giants, creating an ethereal atmosphere that seemed to mark the boundary between the known world and the realm of legend. The 35 men who comprised his crew moved with the quiet efficiency of experienced sailors, making final preparations for their journey into the unknown while speaking in hushed tones, as if afraid that too much noise might wake the spirits that guarded the threshold between familiar shores and undiscovered lands. Each man knew that they were embarking not just on a voyage of exploration, but on a passage that might carry them beyond the edge of the world as their ancestors knew it, into waters where sea monsters might dwell and where the very ocean might pour over the rim of creation into endless void. The ship itself was a masterpiece of Norse craftsmanship, a Nor, a type of vessel designed specifically for long ocean voyages, rather than the coastal raiding that had made Viking longships famous throughout Europe. Unlike the sleeker warships used for lightning-fast attacks on monasteries and trading towns, the Nor was built for cargo capacity and seaworthiness, with a deep hull that could carry provisions for extended expeditions and weather the storms of the North Atlantic without breaking apart under the stress of mountainous waves. Its single square sail, woven from the finest wool by skilled craftswomen and reinforced with leather strips that had been carefully selected from the hides of cattle raised in Greenland's harsh environment, could catch even the lightest breeze and translate it into forward motion. When the wind failed, Its 16 pairs of oars provided reliable propulsion, manned by crew members who had developed the strength and endurance necessary for long hours of rowing through heavy seas. The provisioning of the vessel had taken weeks of careful planning and preparation, for they would be entirely dependent on what they carried with them once they left sight of Greenland's coast. The ship's hold was packed with barrels of fresh water drawn from the clearest streams in the settlement, dried fish that had been carefully preserved, with salt traded from merchants who traveled the dangerous routes to Norway, hardtack bread baked from precious grain that grew only in Greenland's most protected valleys, and wheels of cheese made from the milk of hardy goats that somehow thrived in the Arctic environment. They carried tools for every conceivable repair and construction need, axes and adzes for working wood, hammers and anvils for metalwork, needles and thread for mending sails and clothing, and ropes and tackle for handling the complex rigging that controlled their vessel's movement through the water. As the morning sun burned away the mist, revealing the stark beauty of the Greenland coast, one last time in crystalline detail that seemed almost supernaturally clear, Leif gave the order to cast off from the stone pier that represented the westernmost edge of European civilization. The crew pushed the vessel away from the familiar harbor where it had been moored through the long winter months, and slowly, gracefully, the Nor began to move through the calm waters of the fjord toward the open sea that stretched beyond the mountains like a pathway to other worlds. Behind them, the settlement grew smaller with each stroke of the oars. The wooden buildings and stone churches that had been their whole world for months, becoming mere dots against the vast landscape of ice and stone that had sheltered them through the harsh Greenland winter. The first stage of their journey took them northwest, retracing in reverse the route that Bjarni Herjolfsson had inadvertently discovered 15 years earlier. According to Bjarni's account, he had first sighted a land that was flat and covered with forests, but had sailed on without landing. Then he had encountered a second coastline that was also forested but more mountainous, and finally a third land that was glaciated and appeared worthless for settlement. Leif planned to visit these lands in the opposite order, working his way south along the North American coast. For several days, they sailed through waters increasingly filled with ice. Massive bergs, some the size of cathedrals, drifted past their small vessel like silent monuments to the power of Arctic nature. The crew had to remain constantly vigilant, using long poles to push away smaller ice chunks that could damage their hull, while steering carefully around the larger bergs that could crush their ship like an eggshell. The nights during this part of the voyage were short and pale, for they were traveling during the Arctic summer, when darkness never fully claimed the sky. Instead, the sun traced a low circle around the horizon, dipping toward the water but never quite disappearing, casting the seascape in perpetual twilight hues of gold and purple. In this ethereal light, the ice took on magical qualities, glowing with inner fire and creating optical illusions that could mislead even experienced navigators. Navigation in these waters required all of Leif's inherited skill and intuition. The Norse had no magnetic compass. That innovation would not reach Europe for another 2 centuries. Instead, they relied on their intimate knowledge of celestial patterns, using a sun compass during the day to maintain their heading and following the stars at night. They also used a remarkable crystalline tool called a sunstone, possibly made of Iceland spar, which could locate the sun's position even through heavy cloud cover by analyzing the polarization of light. But perhaps most importantly, they relied on their ability to read the ocean itself. The color of the water could reveal its depth: deep blue for the ocean deeps, green for shallower coastal waters, and pale blue or white where icebergs were melting nearby. The patterns of swells told them about distant weather systems and the presence of land beyond the horizon. Cloud formations could indicate land masses many miles away, while the behavior of seabirds provided clues about the direction and distance to the nearest shore. After sailing northwest for several days, they began to encounter different types of birds, species they recognized from their knowledge of Arctic regions, but in greater numbers and variety than they had seen around Greenland. These included various types of auks, petrels, and gulls, all of which suggested that land was near. The water itself began to change color, taking on the pale green tint that indicated proximity to a continental shelf. Then, on what may have been their 5th or 6th day at sea, a cry came from the lookout posted in the bow of the ship. "Land ho!" rang across the water, and all 35 men strained their eyes westward to catch their first glimpse of the new world. At first, it appeared as nothing more than a low, dark line on the horizon, barely distinguishable from a cloud bank. But as they sailed closer, the land resolved into a coastline unlike anything they had seen before, flat, with what appeared to be extensive ice coverage, but clearly substantial and real. This first land they encountered was almost certainly what we now know as Baffin Island, the 5th largest island in the world, located in what is now the Canadian Arctic archipelago. To the Vikings, it appeared as a forbidding place of glaciers and bare rock, with little to recommend it for settlement or even exploration. Leif reportedly declared it worthy of a name, however, and called it Helluland, flat rock land, a designation that accurately described its stark, ice-scoured landscape. Although they did not land on Helluland, the crew spent several hours sailing along its coast, observing and mapping its general features. They noted the presence of glaciers that reached directly into the sea, the absence of visible vegetation, and the generally hostile appearance of the terrain. This was clearly not the promised land of forests and meadows that Bjarni had described, so after satisfying their curiosity about this first discovery, they turned south to continue their search. Their journey southward along the coast took them through the Labrador Sea, though they sailed far enough from shore that the land was often invisible from their low-decked vessel. This part of the voyage tested their seamanship skills as they encountered rougher waters and more variable weather patterns. Summer storms could arise quickly in these waters, transforming calm seas into mountainous waves within hours. During one particularly memorable evening, as they sailed through calm waters under a sky painted with the colors of the aurora borealis, they encountered a pod of whales. These magnificent creatures, possibly bowhead whales or narwhals, surfaced around their ship with apparent curiosity, their massive forms creating phosphorescent wakes in the dark water. The Vikings watched in respectful silence as these giants of the sea moved through their ancient migration routes, creatures far older and wiser than the human species that had so recently learned to cross the oceans. After several more days of sailing, the lookout again called out the sighting of land. This second coastline appeared different from the first, still northern in character, but showing signs of vegetation along the shore. As they approached, they could see that this land was indeed forested, with stands of what appeared to be spruce and fir trees extending down nearly to the water's edge. The coastline was irregular, cut with numerous bays and inlets that suggested good harbors for landing and exploration. This was almost certainly the coast of Labrador, and Leif named it Markland, Forest Land, in recognition of its most notable feature. Here, the expedition made its first landing on North American soil. They pulled their Nor up onto a sandy beach and set foot on ground that no European had ever walked before. The forest that stretched inland was dominated by conifers, but they also found birch trees whose bark could be useful for waterproofing and other practical purposes. The landing party spent the better part of a day exploring the immediate coastal area, gathering information about the resources available in this new land. They found abundant wildlife signs, tracks of caribou, fox, and other animals that suggested good hunting opportunities. The streams running into the sea were clear and cold, providing excellent fresh water for replenishing their supplies. Most importantly, the vast forests represented a resource that was increasingly precious in their homeland, timber for shipbuilding and construction. However, Markland, while promising, was still not the land of Bjarne's most enthusiastic descriptions. The climate was clearly harsh, similar to northern Greenland, and the growing season would be short and challenging for agriculture. After loading their ship with fresh water and some samples of the local wood, they decided to continue southward in search of the more temperate lands that Bjarne had reported. The next stage of their journey took them around the northern tip of Newfoundland, though they would not have recognized it as an island at the time. They sailed through the Strait of Belle Isle, the narrow waterway that separates Newfoundland from the Labrador Peninsula, entering the Gulf of St. Lawrence without realizing they were passing from the Atlantic Ocean into a massive inland sea. As they continued southward, along what is now the western coast of Newfoundland, the landscape began to change dramatically. The forests became more diverse, with deciduous trees mixing with the conifers they had seen further north. The climate was noticeably milder, and signs of abundant wildlife were everywhere, not just through tracks and droppings, but through direct observation of deer, bears, and countless species of birds. Most remarkably, they began to encounter rivers and streams that teemed with salmon, fish that were running upstream in such numbers that it seemed the water was more salmon than water. For men who had spent years in the harsh environment of Greenland, where every meal required careful planning and considerable effort, the abundance of this new land was almost overwhelming. Here was a place where a small group of people could not just survive, but thrive with relatively little effort. The climate continued to improve as they sailed further south, and the vegetation became increasingly lush and varied. They began to see grasses growing in meadows that reminded them of the best farming areas of Norway and Iceland. There were berry bushes heavy with fruit, nut trees, and most remarkably of all, grapevines growing wild along the coast. It was these wild grapes that would give the new land its Norse name, and it was the discovery of these grapes that convinced Leif that they had found something truly extraordinary. Here was a land where the climate was not just survivable, but actually pleasant, a place where the growing season was long enough to support crops that could never survive in Greenland or Iceland. This was the promised land that would justify the risks and hardships of their long voyage. As evening approached on what may have been their 10th or 12th day since leaving Greenland, Leif ordered his crew to look for a suitable harbor where they could land and establish a temporary base for exploring this remarkable new territory. They found what they were looking for in a sheltered bay with a river flowing into it, surrounded by meadows and forests that seemed to promise everything they could desire for a successful settlement. As they pulled their faithful Nor up onto the beach of this new land, 35 Norse explorers became the first Europeans to establish a presence in North America 500 years before Columbus would make his famous voyage. They had crossed what they called the Whale Road, the vast ocean that connected the known and unknown worlds, and found a land that exceeded their most optimistic expectations. That night, as they made camp on the shores of what they would name Vinland, Leif and his men looked up at unfamiliar constellations rising over an untamed wilderness that stretched beyond their ability to imagine. They had achieved something that no previous generation of Norse explorers had accomplished. They had found a western land that was not just habitable, but genuinely hospitable to human settlement. Tomorrow, they would begin the work of exploring their discovery in earnest. The first dawn in Vinland broke with a gentleness that surprised the Norse explorers after their years in the harsh climates of Iceland and Greenland, where dawn often came like a knife cutting through darkness, sharp and unforgiving. Here, the light crept across the horizon like honey spreading across bread, warm and golden and full of promise for the day ahead. The air was mild and sweet, carrying with it the sense of unfamiliar flowers whose names they did not know but whose beauty they could not deny, and the rich, loamy smell of fertile soil that had never known a plow but seemed to invite cultivation with its dark richness. As Leif Erikson emerged from the simple shelter his crew had constructed on the beach using techniques learned in a dozen different harbors across the North Atlantic, he looked out upon a landscape that seemed almost magical in its abundance and beauty. The morning light revealed details that had been hidden in the previous evening's shadows. Wildflowers carpeting the meadows in colors more vivid than any Viking tapestry, butterflies dancing among them in numbers that seemed almost like a snowfall of living jewels, and in the distance, forests that stretched to the horizon in shades of green that had no names in the Norse language. The bay where they had anchored their faithful Nor was nearly perfectly circular, as if it had been designed by some benevolent god specifically to provide safe harbor for weary travelers from distant lands. It was protected from ocean swells by a narrow entrance that opened onto calmer waters, ideal for their shallow drafted vessel, while underwater rocks and sandbars created natural breakwaters that tamed even the most violent storms. A clear river wound its way through meadowlands like a silver ribbon, carrying fresh water from mountains they could glimpse in the distance before emptying into the bay with a gentle murmur that seemed to welcome them to this new world. Along the banks of this river grew the largest trees many of the crew had ever seen, massive specimens that dwarfed the stunted growth they were accustomed to in their northern homelands, ancient giants that had been growing for centuries without interference from axe or storm. Some of these trees were so large that it would have taken 6 men holding hands to encircle their trunks, their branches reaching so high into the sky that their tops seemed to disappear among the clouds. The wood of these trees, when they examined fallen branches and dead specimens, proved to be of excellent quality, straight-grained and strong, perfect for shipbuilding and construction, a resource more valuable than gold to people whose very survival depended on their ability to build and maintain seaworthy vessels. The water of the river ran so clear that they could see salmon moving in its depths like shadows beneath glass, fish so numerous that it seemed the water was more salmon than water during certain times of the day. These were not the small, struggling fish they sometimes caught in the streams of Greenland, but magnificent specimens as long as a man's arm, their silver scales flashing in the sunlight as they swam upstream in numbers that defied belief. The crew quickly discovered that these fish could be caught with almost ridiculous ease. A simple spear thrust into the water would often yield enough food for an entire meal, while nets stretched across the narrower parts of the stream could fill with fish in minutes. What struck them most forcefully, however, was the sheer abundance of life that surrounded them. In Greenland, every creature and plant had to struggle desperately for survival through the long, dark winters and brief, intense summers. Here in Vinland, life seemed to flourish with an ease that bordered on the miraculous. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in colors more vivid than any Viking tapestry, while butterflies danced among them in numbers that seemed almost like a snowfall of living jewels. Leif organized his crew into exploration parties to systematically investigate their surroundings and assess the resources available in this new land. One group was tasked with following the river inland to determine its length and to map the terrain beyond the coastal plains. Another was assigned to explore the coastline both north and south of their landing site, looking for other harbors and noting any signs of human habitation. A third group remained at the base camp to establish more permanent shelters and to begin the process of cataloging the plant and animal life they encountered. The inland exploration party returned after 2 days with reports that exceeded even their most optimistic expectations. The river, they reported, extended far inland through a landscape of gently rolling hills covered with mixed forests of deciduous and coniferous trees. They had found extensive meadowlands that appeared ideal for grazing livestock, and numerous smaller streams that could provide both fresh water and power for mills. Most remarkably, they had discovered several small lakes that were so thick with fish that a man could practically walk across them on the backs of salmon and trout. The coastal survey team brought back equally encouraging news. The shoreline extended both north and south in a series of protected bays and inlets, each offering potential harbors for Norse ships. They had found no signs of permanent human settlement, though they did discover evidence that the area was occasionally visited by hunting parties, old fire pits, scattered bones from butchered animals, and the remains of temporary shelters that suggested the presence of native peoples who might be encountered eventually. But it was the botanical survey that produced the discovery that would give Vinland its name and its place in Norse legend. Deep in the forest, growing wild in abundance that suggested perfect natural conditions, they found grapevines heavy with fruit. These were not the small, sour berries that sometimes grew in the milder parts of Iceland, but genuine grapes suitable for making wine, a luxury that was virtually unknown in the Norse settlements of the North Atlantic. The discovery of wild grapes was significant far beyond their potential for winemaking. In the medieval world, grapes were considered an indicator of truly temperate climate, a sign that the land was blessed with conditions favorable for all manner of agriculture. Where grapes could grow, so could wheat and barley, fruits and vegetables, all the crops that made the difference between mere survival and genuine prosperity. The presence of these vines suggested that Vinland might support not just a few hardy settlers, but an entire population living in comfort unknown in the harsh northern latitudes of their homeland. Leif declared that they would spend the remainder of the summer and the coming winter in Vinland, using the time to thoroughly explore the region and to test its suitability for permanent settlement. The crew began construction of more substantial dwellings, using techniques they had perfected in Iceland and Greenland, but adapting them to take advantage of the abundant local materials. They built their houses from the massive timber available in the local forests, creating structures far larger and more comfortable than anything they could have constructed in their resource-poor homeland. The settlement they created was positioned strategically at the head of the bay, on a slight rise that provided good drainage and a commanding view of both the harbor and the river valley inland. The main hall was constructed in the traditional Norse style, but its dimensions were generous by the standards of Greenland or Iceland, large enough to house the entire crew comfortably through the winter months. Around this central structure, they built workshops, storage buildings, and smaller private dwellings, creating what amounted to a complete Norse community in the heart of North America. As autumn approached in Vinland, the crew discovered another of the region's remarkable advantages. While winter in Greenland brought months of total darkness, fierce storms, and temperatures that could kill an unprotected person within minutes, the winter in Vinland was surprisingly mild. Snow fell, but not in the crushing depths they were accustomed to, and there were many days when the sun shone brightly in clear blue skies that reminded them of spring weather in their northern homes. The abundance of wildlife made hunting not just possible, but almost effortless throughout the winter months. Deer could be taken within a few hundred yards of their settlement, providing not only meat, but also hides for clothing and leather goods. The rivers never froze completely, ensuring a constant supply of fresh fish to supplement their diet. Wild birds, including various species of waterfowl, remained in the area throughout the winter, offering both food and valuable feathers for bedding and clothing insulation. Perhaps most remarkably, they discovered that many of the local plants remained edible throughout the winter months. There were nuts and berries that could be gathered well into the cold season, and certain roots and shoots that provided valuable nutrition when meat and fish were temporarily scarce. The local knowledge they began to acquire suggested that a permanent settlement could be virtually self-sufficient within a few years, requiring only minimal support from the Greenland colonies. During the long winter evenings, gathered around the fire in their comfortable hall, the crew began to plan for the future of Vinland. Some spoke of returning to Greenland in the spring to recruit family members and additional settlers who could help establish a permanent Norse presence in this new land. 5. Others suggested that they should first spend another summer exploring further south and west to determine the full extent of the resources available and to assess the long-term prospects for colonization. Leif himself remained cautiously optimistic but practical in his approach to the future. He recognized that while Vinland offered unprecedented opportunities for Norse settlement, it also presented challenges that would require careful planning and considerable resources to overcome. The distance from Greenland meant that the settlement would be largely isolated, dependent on its own resources, and unable to rely on regular supply ships from the established colonies. Any permanent settlers would need to be completely self-sufficient in everything from food production to tool-making to medical care. As winter gradually gave way to spring, the crew began to encounter more evidence of the native peoples who occasionally used the region. They found recently used campsites along the river, and on several occasions they glimpsed figures moving through the forest at a distance, though no direct contact was made during that first winter. The presence of these indigenous inhabitants added another layer of complexity to any plans for permanent settlement. Though the Vikings were experienced in both trade and conflict with foreign peoples from their years of raiding and trading throughout Europe, the spring thaw in Vinland revealed the full extent of the region's agricultural potential. The meadowlands burst into flower even earlier and more abundantly than the previous year, while the forest showed new growth that demonstrated the exceptionally favorable growing conditions. Leif's men began experimental cultivation of some of the seeds they had brought from Greenland, and were amazed to discover that barley and other grains grew with unprecedented vigor in the rich soil of Vinland. By early summer, Leif had made his decision about the future of their expedition. They would return to Greenland before the next winter, carrying with them samples of Vinland's bounty and detailed reports of their discoveries. The goal was to recruit a larger group of settlers who could establish a permanent colony, complete with families, livestock, and all the tools necessary for creating a thriving Norse community in the New World. Before their departure, the crew spent several weeks gathering specimens and creating detailed maps of the region they had explored. They collected samples of all the different types of wood available, various medicinal plants they had identified, and of course, dried grapes that would serve as proof of Vinland's agricultural potential. They also carved runes into several prominent stones, marking their discovery for future Norse explorers who might follow in their footsteps. The loading of their Nor for the return journey was a bittersweet process. The ship's hold was filled with treasures that would astound the people of Greenland, timber of a quality and size unknown in their treeless homeland, furs from animals they had never seen before, and foods that would seem like gifts from the gods to people accustomed to the harsh diet of Arctic subsistence. Yet many of the crew members found themselves reluctant to leave this paradise they had discovered, knowing that the return to Greenland would mean once again facing the challenges of survival in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. As their faithful ship once again took to the northern waters, heading northeast toward home, 35 men carried with them knowledge that would change the Norse understanding of the world forever. They had proven that the Atlantic Ocean was not an endless barrier separating the known world from a realm of monsters and chaos, but rather a pathway to lands of incredible richness and promise. They had discovered that the world was far larger and more diverse than their ancestors had ever imagined, and that the techniques of seamanship and navigation developed in the harsh waters of the North Atlantic could carry brave explorers to continents beyond their wildest dreams. The voyage home was swifter than their outbound journey, aided by favorable winds and currents, and guided by their now familiar knowledge of the landmarks and hazards along the route. When the familiar mountains of Greenland finally appeared on the eastern horizon, they were greeted as heroes returning from the very edge of the world. The treasures they brought back, and more importantly, the stories they told of Vinland's abundance, would inspire a generation of Norse explorers to follow in their wake. The return of Leif Erikson to Greenland in the summer of 1002 sent ripples of excitement throughout the Norse communities of the North Atlantic that grew into waves of anticipation and planning. Word of Vinland's discovery spread like wildfire through the scattered settlements, carried by traders and storytellers who embellished the already remarkable tales with each retelling, adding details born of imagination to facts that were already almost too wonderful to believe. In the long halls where families gathered during the brief Arctic summers, when the midnight sun made it possible to work and plan far into what should have been night, conversations turned inevitably to this new land where grapes grew wild and winter was said to be no harsher than autumn in the milder valleys of Iceland. The stories took on lives of their own as they spread from settlement to settlement across Greenland and back to Iceland, growing more elaborate with each telling like plants that flourish in fertile soil. Some told of forests so vast that a man could walk for days without seeing the sky, filled with trees whose wood was so perfect that a single trunk could provide timber for an entire ship. Others spoke of rivers so thick with salmon that a person could walk across them on the backs of the fish, and of meadows where the grass grew so lush and sweet that livestock would grow fat simply by being turned loose to graze. Still others claimed that the very air in Vinland had healing properties, that the sick and elderly who made the journey there would find their youth restored by the gentle climate and abundant food. Erik the Red, now aging but still possessed of the restless spirit that had driven him to explore Greenland decades earlier, listened to his son's accounts with a mixture of pride and longing that burned in his chest like a banked fire suddenly given fresh fuel. Though his arthritis-stiffened joints and grey beard marked the passage of years that could not be denied, Erik's eyes still held the fire that had carried him across unknown seas to establish the Greenland colonies at a time when most men his current age would have been content to sit by their hearths and tell stories of their youth. The prospect of one more great adventure, one final expedition to crown a lifetime of exploration and discovery, stirred something deep in his soul that age and infirmity had not been able to extinguish. He began to plan what he hoped would be one final great expedition, not merely another voyage of exploration like his son's journey, but a comprehensive colonization effort that would establish a permanent Norse presence in Vinland and secure his family's legacy as the discoverers of new worlds beyond the Western Ocean. This would be an undertaking on a scale never before attempted in the history of Norse exploration, involving not just warriors and adventurers, but entire families willing to abandon their hard-won homes in Greenland for the promise of easier lives in a more hospitable land. It would require ships, supplies, livestock, and most importantly, the kind of skilled settlers who could establish not just a temporary camp, but a thriving community capable of sustaining itself indefinitely without support from the mother colonies. However, fate intervened in the form of a riding accident that left Erik the Red injured and unable to lead the expedition himself, a cruel twist that seemed designed to test his faith in the very gods who had guided him through so many previous adventures. The injury occurred during a routine journey between settlements when his horse stepped in a hidden hole and fell, pinning the aging explorer beneath its weight and crushing several ribs that would never quite heal properly. As he lay recovering from his injuries in the early months of 1003, forced to remain bedridden while others made the decisions that would shape the future of Norse exploration in the New World, the leadership of the Vinland colonization effort passed to other hands, hands that would prove both capable and, ultimately, tragically flawed in their understanding of what such an undertaking would require. The first to take up the challenge was Leif Erikson, Leif's younger brother, who possessed much of his family's courage and curiosity, but perhaps lacked some of Leif's wisdom and diplomatic skills. Thorvald assembled a crew of 30 men and, using Leif's detailed sailing directions, successfully reached Vinland in the summer of 1003. They took up residence in the buildings that Leif's expedition had constructed, calling the settlement Leifsbudir, Leif's Booths, in honor of the first European to establish a base in the New World. Thorvald's expedition differed from his brother's in its primary objective. While Leif had focused on exploration and assessment, Thorvald came with the intention of expanding Norse knowledge of the North American coastline and establishing trade relationships with whatever peoples they might encounter. His men spent their first summer in Vinland, exploring the intricate coastline to the north and east, mapping the countless bays and inlets that characterized the region, and assessing the potential for additional settlement sites. The explorations revealed that Vinland was even more extensive than Leif's initial surveys had suggested. The coast stretched both north and south, far beyond what a single expedition could map in one season, and inland reconnaissance suggested that the temperate climate and abundant resources extended well beyond the coastal regions. Rivers and lakes throughout the interior teemed with fish, while the forests showed signs of abundant wildlife that could support a large population of hunters and trappers. During their second summer in Vinland, Thorvald's expedition achieved something that had eluded Leif's group: direct contact with the native inhabitants of North America. The encounter occurred along a remote stretch of coastline where the Vikings had beached their ship for repairs after a minor collision with a hidden rock. As they worked on their vessel, 3 small boats approached from around a nearby headland, each carrying several men who appeared to be investigating these strange visitors to their territory. The native peoples they encountered were members of what archaeologists now believe were either Dorset or early Thule cultures, skilled hunters and maritime peoples who had inhabited the Arctic and subarctic regions of North America for thousands of years. They approached the Vikings with understandable caution, clearly curious about these pale-skinned strangers with their massive ship and unfamiliar tools and weapons. Unfortunately, the first meeting between Europeans and Native Americans in recorded history did not proceed peacefully, whether due to miscommunication, cultural misunderstanding, or simple fear on both sides. Violence erupted almost immediately. The Vikings, vastly outnumbered and caught off guard by the sudden appearance of the native boats, reacted with the warrior instincts that had served them well in raids across Europe. In the brief but fierce skirmish that followed, several of the native hunters were killed, while others escaped to spread word of the hostile strangers who had appeared in their territory. Thorvald himself was mortally wounded in this encounter, struck by an arrow that penetrated between the joints of his makeshift armor. As he lay dying on the beach of the land he had hoped to colonize, he reportedly told his men that they had found a beautiful country, but that it would be a difficult place for them to settle. His last words were a request to be buried on a headland overlooking the sea, with crosses placed at his head and feet, making him quite possibly the first European to be buried in North America. The death of their leader and the realization that Vinland was inhabited by peoples who would not welcome Norse colonization cast a shadow over the expedition's remaining activities. The survivors spent the remainder of that summer preparing for their return to Greenland, loading their ship with valuable timber and other resources, but abandoning any plans for immediate permanent settlement. They departed Vinland in the autumn of 1005, carrying with them both the treasures of the new land and the sobering knowledge that its colonization would be far more difficult than anyone had anticipated. News of Thorvald's death and the hostile reception they had received from the native inhabitants might have ended Norse interest in Vinland, but the saga of exploration was far from over. The lure of the new land's incredible resources, combined with the Norse cultural emphasis on courage in the face of adversity, inspired others to take up the challenge of establishing a permanent European presence in North America. The next major expedition was organized by Thorfinn Karlsefni, an Icelandic merchant who had married into Leif Erikson's extended family and thus gained access to the detailed knowledge of Vinland navigation that the family possessed. Karlsefni was a practical man, a successful trader who understood both the challenges and the opportunities involved in establishing new settlements in hostile environments. Unlike the previous expeditions, which had been essentially military operations, Karlsefni's voyage was planned as a genuine colonization effort, complete with women, children, livestock, and all the tools and supplies necessary for creating a self-sufficient community. In the spring of 1007, Karlsefni's fleet of 3 ships carrying some 160 settlers departed from Greenland bound for Vinland. Among the colonists were craftsmen, farmers, and their families, people who possessed the skills necessary for creating and maintaining a permanent settlement far from the support of established communities. They brought with them cattle, sheep, and goats, hoping to establish the livestock herds that would be essential for long-term survival in the new land. The voyage to Vinland proceeded without major incident, guided by the increasingly familiar sailing directions that had now been proven on multiple expeditions. However, when the colonists arrived at Leifsbudir, they found evidence that the site had been visited by native peoples during the intervening years since Thorvald's departure. The buildings had been partially dismantled, and there were signs that local inhabitants had been investigating the strange structures and attempting to understand the purposes of the various Norse tools and implements that had been left behind. Karlsefni's people quickly re-established the settlement, rebuilding and expanding the structures to accommodate their larger population and their livestock. The first months in Vinland proceeded much as Leif's original expedition had. The settlers marveled at the abundance of the land and began the process of establishing farms and workshops that could support their community through the coming winter. The women in the expedition were particularly impressed with the potential for textile production, as they discovered plants suitable for dyeing fabric and fibers that could be woven into cloth to supplement the wool from their sheep. However, it soon became clear that the native inhabitants had not forgotten the violence of the previous Norse expedition. Throughout their first autumn in Vinland, the colonists began to notice signs of surveillance, tracks around their settlement, evidence that their activities were being watched from the surrounding forests, and occasionally glimpses of figures observing them from distant hilltops. The indigenous peoples were clearly trying to understand these persistent invaders and to assess the threat they represented to traditional ways of life that had existed in the region for countless generations. The second contact between Europeans and Native Americans occurred the following spring, and initially it proceeded more peacefully than Thorvald's fatal encounter. A group of native hunters approached the settlement, under what appeared to be a flag of truce, carrying trade goods and indicating through gestures their interest in exchanging local products for Norse manufactured items. For several weeks, a tentative trade relationship developed, with the native peoples providing furs, fresh food, and knowledge of local resources in exchange for iron tools, cloth, and other European products that they found useful. This peaceful period allowed both sides to learn something about each other's cultures and ways of life. The Norse settlers discovered that the local inhabitants possessed sophisticated knowledge of the North American environment, including seasonal migration patterns of animals, the locations of the best fishing grounds, and techniques for processing and preserving foods that were new to European experience. The native peoples, in turn, were fascinated by Norse ironworking technology, livestock husbandry, and construction techniques that allowed the creation of permanent heated structures. However, cultural differences and misunderstandings eventually led to renewed conflict. The Norse concept of land ownership, which involved claiming and permanently occupying territory for exclusive use, conflicted fundamentally with indigenous concepts of land use, which typically involved seasonal occupation of hunting and fishing grounds that were considered common resources for the entire community. Additionally, the presence of Norse livestock began to interfere with traditional hunting patterns, as the cattle and sheep altered the local ecosystem and drove away some of the wildlife that the native peoples depended upon for survival. Tensions escalated throughout the summer of 1008 and eventually erupted into open warfare when a dispute over trade goods led to violence that claimed lives on both sides. Unlike Thorvald's small expedition, Karlsefni's colonists had the numbers and weapons necessary to defend themselves effectively, but they found themselves under constant harassment from a native population that vastly outnumbered them and possessed intimate knowledge of the local terrain. What had begun as a promising colonization effort became an exhausting siege that made normal life impossible for the Norse settlers. The birth of Snorri Thorfinnsson during this period of conflict holds a special place in the history of European colonization in the Americas. Snorri was the first European known to have been born in North America, and his birth represented both the promise and the tragedy of the Norse colonization effort. Here was a child who was truly a citizen of the New World, born on American soil to European parents, representing the potential for a new kind of society that could bridge the old world and the new. Yet he was born into a community under siege, surrounded by conflict that would ultimately doom the entire colonization effort. By the autumn of 1009, it had become clear to Karlsefni and his fellow colonists that their situation was unsustainable. Despite Vinland's abundant resources and favorable climate, the persistent hostility of the native inhabitants made it impossible to establish the peaceful, thriving community they had envisioned. The constant threat of attack made farming and hunting dangerous, while the need to maintain constant vigilance exhausted the colonists and prevented them from taking full advantage of the land's potential. The decision to abandon Vinland was not made lightly, for it meant giving up what many of the colonists had come to see as their true home. Children like Snorri had no memories of any other land, while adults had invested 2 years of their lives in building what they had hoped would be permanent homes in the new world. However, the realities of their situation left them little choice but to load their ships once again with the treasures of Vinland and return to the familiar but harsh environment of Greenland. The departure from Vinland in 1010 marked the end of the most serious Norse attempt to establish a permanent presence in North America. As Karlsefni's ships disappeared over the eastern horizon, they carried with them not only the survivors of the failed colony, but also the knowledge and experience that would prevent future large-scale colonization efforts. The dream of a Norse Vinland had proven too difficult to realize with the resources and knowledge available to medieval Europeans. Yet the failure of permanent colonization did not end Norse contact with North America. For several more decades, occasional expeditions continued to visit Vinland to harvest its valuable timber and other resources. These trading voyages, led by men like Leif's sister Freydis, continued the connection between the Norse world and North America, even as the dream of permanent settlement faded into legend and eventually into myth. As the last Norse ship departed from the shores of Vinland in the early years of the 11th century, it carried away more than just the survivors of a failed colonial experiment. In its wake, it left behind traces of European presence that would lie hidden in the North American wilderness for nearly 1,000 years, waiting to be rediscovered by archaeologists and historians who could barely imagine the courage required for such early transatlantic voyages. But perhaps more importantly, it carried eastward across the Atlantic the memory of a land so rich and promising that it would live on in Norse legend and saga, long after the last person who had actually seen Vinland had passed into the realm of ancestors. The stories of Vinland became part of the great oral tradition of the Norse peoples, passed down through generations of storytellers who gathered in the long halls during the endless winter nights of Greenland and Iceland. These tales grew and evolved with each telling, becoming increasingly elaborate and mythical as they moved further from their historical origins. Yet at their core, they preserved an essential truth that brave Norse explorers had indeed found and briefly settled a land far to the west, a land of abundance and promise that stood in stark contrast to the harsh environments they had learned to call home. In the saga of Erik the Red and the saga of the Greenlanders, written down centuries later by Icelandic scholars who sought to preserve their people's heritage, we can still hear echoes of the wonder and disappointment that characterized the Norse experience in North America. These sagas, while not strictly historical documents in the modern sense, preserve details that could only have come from people who had actually made the voyage to Vinland and walked upon its shores. They describe with remarkable accuracy the geography of the North American coast, the natural resources available in different regions, and the challenges faced by medieval Europeans attempting to establish themselves in a land already occupied by peoples with thousands of years of experience in that environment. Meanwhile, in the Greenland settlements that had served as the launching point for the Vinland expeditions, life continued its harsh but sustainable rhythm for several more centuries. The knowledge gained from the North American voyages contributed to the success of the Greenland colonies, as the valuable timber harvested from Vinland helped maintain the ships and buildings that were essential for survival in the Arctic environment. Occasional voyages continued to make the journey to Markland for wood throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, maintaining a tenuous connection between the Norse world and North America long after the abandonment of permanent settlement attempts. However, the Greenland colonies themselves faced increasing challenges as the medieval period progressed. Climate change during the Little Ice Age made the already difficult task of survival in Greenland nearly impossible, while political changes in Europe reduced support for the remote Nordic settlements. By the 15th century, regular contact between Greenland and the outside world had ceased entirely, and the Norse settlements that had launched the first European exploration of North America had themselves been abandoned to the ice and wind. As the memory of living Norse presence in Greenland faded, so too did accurate knowledge of their achievements in North America. European scholars of the Renaissance and later periods, focused as they were on the classical traditions of Greece and Rome, paid little attention to the oral traditions of the barbarian Norse peoples. When Christopher Columbus made his famous voyage in 1492, he believed he was attempting something that had never been done before, crossing the Atlantic to reach new lands in the service of European exploration and colonization. Columbus, like most educated Europeans of his time, knew nothing of Leif Erikson or Thorfinn Karlsefni. He had never heard of Vinland or Markland, and could not have imagined that Norse explorers had preceded him across the Atlantic by nearly 5 centuries. His voyage, momentous as it was in its consequences for world history, was essentially a rediscovery of what the Vikings had found and lost 500 years earlier. The difference, of course, was that Columbus's voyage came at a time when European technology, population, and political organization were sufficient to support permanent colonization efforts that could overcome the challenges that had defeated the medieval Norse. For centuries after Columbus, the Norse voyages to North America remained buried in the realm of legend and folklore. Scholars who encountered references to Vinland in medieval Icelandic manuscripts dismissed them as fantasy, unable to believe that the relatively primitive technology of the Viking Age could have supported transatlantic exploration. The prevailing view among historians was that Columbus represented the first serious European contact with the New World, and that any earlier claims were simply mythical embellishments of the type common in medieval literature. It was not until the 19th century that serious scholars began to reconsider the historical accuracy of the Vinland sagas. Danish and Norwegian historians, influenced by growing nationalist movements that sought to celebrate the achievements of their medieval ancestors, began systematic studies of the Icelandic manuscripts that preserved the stories of Norse exploration. They recognized that many of the geographical details described in the sagas were too accurate and specific to have been pure fantasy, and began to argue that the voyages to Vinland must have been based on actual historical events. The debate over the historicity of the Vinland voyages continued well into the 20th century, with skeptics arguing that there was no physical evidence to support the literary claims. Unlike the well-documented Spanish, Portuguese, and other European colonization efforts of the 15th and 16th centuries, the Norse voyages had left no obvious traces that could be examined by archaeologists and historians. The lack of artifacts, ruins, or other physical evidence led many scholars to conclude that the Vinland sagas, however entertaining, were essentially works of fiction rather than historical records. This skeptical view persisted until 1960, when Norwegian archaeologist Helge Ingstad and his wife, Anne Steen Ingstad, made a discovery that would revolutionize understanding of Norse exploration in North America. Working at Meadows, a remote site on the northern tip of Newfoundland, they uncovered the remains of what was unmistakably a Norse settlement, the first and only confirmed archaeological evidence of pre-Columbian European presence in North America. The Meadows site contained the foundations of several buildings constructed in typical Norse style, along with artifacts that could only have come from Scandinavian sources. Carbon dating of organic materials found at the site confirmed that the settlement had been occupied around 1000 CE, exactly matching the time frame described in the Vinland sagas. Here, finally, was physical proof that the stories passed down through generations of Norse storytellers had been based on actual historical events. The discovery at Meadows transformed academic understanding of early European exploration and settled once and for all the question of whether the Norse had reached North America. However, it also raised new questions about the extent and nature of Norse activities in the New World. The Meadows settlement was clearly temporary, a base camp used for exploration and resource gathering rather than a permanent colony. This matched the archaeological evidence, which suggested that the site had been occupied for only a few years before being abandoned. Subsequent archaeological investigations have revealed additional evidence of Norse presence in North America, though none as conclusive as Meadows. Possible Norse artifacts have been found at various sites along the North American coast, though many of these discoveries remain controversial and their interpretation disputed among scholars. What seems clear is that Norse contact with North America was more extensive than the single settlement at Meadows, but less intensive than the full-scale colonization efforts described in some versions of the sagas. The scientific confirmation of Norse voyages to North America has had profound implications for understanding both medieval history and the early contact period between Europeans and Native Americans. It demonstrates that medieval Europeans were capable of far more sophisticated navigation and exploration than previously believed, and that the technological gap between the Viking Age and the Age of Exploration was not as vast as historians had assumed. It also provides the first documented example of sustained contact between Europeans and the indigenous peoples of North America, offering insights into how such encounters might proceed under different historical circumstances. From a broader historical perspective, the Norse voyages to Vinland represent both an remarkable achievement and a fascinating might-have-been of world history. The Vikings accomplished something that would not be repeated for another 5 centuries. They successfully crossed the North Atlantic and established a presence in the New World using only medieval technology and navigation techniques. They proved that the ocean was not an insurmountable barrier, but rather a highway that could carry determined explorers to new lands and opportunities. Yet, their failure to establish permanent settlements also illustrates the challenges that faced any medieval European attempt at colonization in North America. Unlike the later Spanish and English colonial efforts, which were backed by powerful nation-states with substantial resources and military capabilities, the Norse expeditions were essentially private ventures undertaken by small communities already struggling for survival in marginal environments. They lacked the population, technology, and organizational support necessary to overcome the resistance of well-established indigenous societies that had occupied North America for thousands of years. Had the Norse succeeded in establishing permanent colonies in North America, the entire course of world history might have been different. Native American societies might have had several additional centuries to adapt to European diseases and technologies before the arrival of Columbus and the conquistadors. The devastating impact of European colonization on indigenous populations might have been lessened if contact had occurred gradually over a longer period of time rather than in the sudden, overwhelming wave that characterized the post-Columbian period. From the perspective of European development, successful Norse colonization of North America might have provided Scandinavia with resources and opportunities that could have altered the balance of power in medieval Europe. The timber, Furs and other resources of Vinland could have supported larger populations in Greenland and Iceland, creating a Norse Atlantic empire that might have rivaled the later Spanish and Portuguese empires in scope and influence. The course of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and other major European historical developments might have been significantly different if a Norse North America had been part of the medieval world system. But these are questions for alternative historians and historical novelists rather than for serious scholars. What we know for certain is that the Norse voyages to North America represent one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of exploration, accomplished by people whose courage and seamanship skills enabled them to bridge continents using only the technology available to 11th century Europeans. Their story deserves to be remembered not just as an interesting footnote to the Columbus narrative, but as a significant historical achievement in its own right. Today, as we face our own challenges in exploring new frontiers, whether in the depths of the ocean, the reaches of space, or the complexities of the digital world, the example of Leif Erikson and his fellow Norse explorers continues to inspire. They remind us that human curiosity and courage can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, that the horizon always calls to those brave enough to answer, and that the greatest adventures often belong to those willing to sail beyond the edge of their known world in search of something better. The aurora borealis that dances across the Arctic sky above Lons or Meadows looks much the same today as it did when Leif Erikson's crew first saw it more than 1,000 years ago. The same constellations that guided Norse ships across the North Atlantic still shine down on modern explorers and dreamers. In the whisper of wind through the grass at that remote Newfoundland site, we can still hear echoes of the voices that called this land Vinland the Good, and perhaps catch a glimpse of the dreams that carried brave souls across an ocean to touch the shores of a new world 5 centuries before Columbus ever set sail. And so our journey through the mists of time draws to its gentle close, like a faithful longship returning to harbor after a voyage across distant seas that has tested the courage and skill of all aboard. We have sailed with Leif Erikson and his brave companions across the whale road to Vinland, through waters that reflected the northern lights like scattered jewels, following currents and winds that had never before carried European vessels to American shores. We have witnessed their wonder at discovering a land of incredible abundance, felt their amazement at finding forests larger than any they had ever imagined, rivers thick with salmon, and meadows where wild grapes grew heavy on the vine-like promises of prosperity. We have shared in both their triumphs and their ultimate disappointment as they found themselves unable to make a permanent home in their newfound paradise, defeated not by the harshness of the land, but by the complex challenges of establishing peaceful coexistence with peoples who had called that land home for thousands of years before any European ship appeared on the horizon. We have followed the dreams and failures, of those who came after Leif, Thorvald with his fatal encounter, Karlsefni with his ambitious colonization attempt that brought families and livestock across the ocean, only to retreat in the face of persistent conflict. As you drift towards sleep, let your mind linger on the image of those Norse explorers standing on the shores of North America for the first time, breathing the sweet air of Vinland and marveling at grapevines heavy with fruit that seemed to offer a promise of easier living than anything they had known in the harsh northern lands they called home. Imagine the courage it took to sail beyond the edge of the known world, trusting only in their skills and the faithful longships that carried them safely across 1,000 miles of open ocean where storms could arise without warning and icebergs drifted like floating mountains. Feel the wonder they must have experienced as they realized they had found something beyond their boldest dreams, a land that challenged everything they thought they knew about the world's limits and possibilities. Their story reminds us that exploration and discovery are timeless human drives, burning in the hearts of those who refuse to accept that the horizon marks the end of possibility. In every generation there are those who hear the call of distant horizons and find the courage to answer, whether they sail across unknown oceans, venture into uncharted wilderness, or explore the frontiers of human knowledge and understanding. 500 years before Columbus, the Vikings proved that the Atlantic was not a barrier but a pathway, that courage and skill could carry determined explorers to lands beyond imagination, opening new chapters in the story of human achievement. Their legacy lives on not just in archaeological sites where patient scholars uncover the remains of their brief presence, or in ancient sagas where their adventures are preserved in verse and story, but in the spirit of adventure that continues to drive human exploration and discovery in every age. From the Vikings who crossed the North Atlantic in wooden ships, to the astronauts who venture into the vast darkness of space, from the deep-sea explorers who probe the mysteries of the ocean depths, to the scientists who push the boundaries of human knowledge, the same spirit of curiosity and courage drives us forward toward new frontiers and undiscovered territories. Rest well, knowing that somewhere in the vast expanse of time and space, Norse ships still sail across starlit seas toward unknown shores, their dragon-headed prows cutting through waves that sparkle with phosphorescence, while the aurora borealis dances overhead in sheets of green and purple light. Their crews carry dreams of discovery and the eternal hope of finding something wonderful beyond the next horizon, something that will justify the risks they have taken and the hardships they have endured in pursuit of knowledge and adventure. Let the gentle rhythm of imagined waves carry you into peaceful slumber, where your own dreams might take you on voyages of wonder and discovery as remarkable as those of Leif Erikson and the brave souls who first brought European eyes to the shores of North America. Sleep now, fellow traveler, and may your dreams be filled with the magic of exploration, the beauty of undiscovered lands waiting beyond the horizon, and the timeless courage of those who dare to venture beyond the familiar into the realm of infinite possibility where new worlds await those bold enough to seek them. In your dreams, may you sail with the Vikings across the whale road to Vinland, where summer lingers long and winter shows mercy, where the very air whispers of adventure and the distant shores call to the dreamer in every human soul.